I was thinking back to my early memories as a composer, which aren't that early. I started relatively late. I was about 20 when I started writing songs and doing kind of sound collages. And so there are two things that come up. One is I wrote some songs that were kind of mixed meter waltzes that ended up being going in loops and loops forever
Yeah.
and ever. Kind of these like palindrome or like snake eating their tail sketches that I played with a band that I had in college. And then I also was doing sound collages. So I was going out in rural Ohio, where I lived at the time, and making field recordings of different nature sounds and then splicing them together in software and using that to create little compositions.
What were those early compositions? I mean, you mentioned like mixed meter and that sort of thing, and then sound collages is kind of its own thing. I mean, what drew you to doing that? Because you, as a performer, you're a violist, right?
Yeah, I go way back as a violist and started composing much later. So yeah, I started the mixed meter songs and waltzy things, and the sound collages were kind of happening simultaneously but separately. And I think that's interesting actually because I've continued over the years to kind of keep songwriting and composing somewhat separate, even though they intertwine a lot in my practice. But yeah, back then I was feeling kind of pinned down by my viola, classical viola studies. I was in a conservatory setting and I was at Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio for my undergrad. And I loved performing and playing, but I just felt squelched, as many conservatory students do, by the extreme requirements and the technical regimen that I was expected to
Mm.
follow. So I started doing these little songs and compositions as a way to get away outside of that box and kind of escape into another world.
So I talk to composers sometimes who like I talked to a composer a couple weeks ago who his answer to that question was like when I was 4 or 5 which is not my experience in any way and not yours either. And then other composers who do start like composing what we would consider later, like once they're kind of well into like an undergraduate degree. I mean, what how did that evolve from there? And I mean, it sounds like it was kind of separate from your studies a little bit, or did it start to become
Yeah,
more integrated in some way?
it started out being separate, but then I started taking some electronic music courses in the last year I was doing my undergraduate. And so I was able to start exploring computer music and synthesizers and just learning the very basics of electronic music during that time. And that kind of led me into composing more as I got out of school. And I took a few years after college to experiment, and I did a lot of programming in Max MSP and created some sound installations that now feel very different from what I'm doing, but at the same time they kind of informed and shaped who I am today.
So, like, your roots in composition are very much attached to like production and electronic music, then.
Yeah, they are. But I also had such a long, like my whole childhood, I was a really devout violist, for lack of a better word. I was very passionate about being a violist, and I still play a lot. So all of those years from age 8 through 20 ish informed what I started to create when I started making songs and electronic music things. And then I didn't really compose acoustic pieces until it was kind of a gradual process, but a few years after that. So, 23, 24, I started writing my first official piece for an acoustic instrument, which was for viola and electronics.
Yeah, I dig it. I mean, what kind of music were you listening to at that time when you were first starting to compose? Because I mean, like, I listened to a lot of like bands that did mixed like math rock and progressive metal and that sort of thing when I was in high school, and so mixed meter really resonates with me, and that's why I'm kind of stuck on it because that's always been a part of my musical language and what I've loved. I mean, what kind of
Hmm.
music informed those early compositions?
I was listening to a really bizarre assortment of things. Some of them were from my conservatory studies, so I was kind of getting exposed to early electronic music, like music concrete and Pierre Schaeffer's music. I heard Hildegard Westerkamp's music for the first time and met her when I was an undergrad. So that had an impact. And then I was also really into Radiohead, like
Yeah.
from the end of high school kind of into college. So I definitely drew some inspiration from their sound. And then I learned that Paul Lansky's piece Meal and Lease was actually sampled in a Radiohead song that I loved. And so all of these kinds of cross genre things started happening. And I also was listening to Tin Hat, I think is the name of the group, one of Carla Kilstedt's projects. And they did a lot of mixed meter kind of folk influenced songs that also had violin and viola in them. So I took some inspiration there, and I was listening to a lot of jazz and Cecil Taylor of all people.
Yeah.
And now I talk to my husband, who's a jazz pianist, and he's like, you were listening to who when you started listening to jazz? And I'm like, yeah, Cecil Taylor. But I loved like just the wildness of hearing his solos and his style at that point.
When would you say your first encounter with a composer was? Was that in your undergrad studies?
Actually, it was in high school, in my senior year of high school. I was in this chamber ensemble with a pianist composer. It was a student group, and we became really good friends there and kind of started hanging out. And it was actually like the start of my very short rebellious phase of high school, which was really only in my senior year. But I started like skipping school and going to hang out with this group of friends, including this composer. And we would like go on aimless road trips and kind of stop at just random points along the highway and see what was there and listen to Radiohead.
Yeah.
So that was really my first encounter with a composer. And I think I also performed a living composer's works in that group, although I don't know if they were at our performances.
That's an interesting thought that it was a group of musicians that led to and a composer of all people to lead you to be, like, skipping school and stuff. That's it's kinda
Yeah,
funny.
it was kind of bizarre. But yeah, I was very like studious for much of my high school time, and then I finally found a few friends that I felt like I could like really kind of go outside of the bounds of my previous existence.
Yeah, yeah, I gotcha. So, can you kinda connect the dots for us? I mean, you started really composing kinda late into undergrad. What was your creative journey like after that? Like, what kind of I mean, as briefly as you feel like, I mean, what were the steps that have led you to the composer you are today?
Like I mentioned earlier, I started with electronic music. I did these sound collages with field recordings. I still have a lot of those field recordings, and I hope to use them in other pieces. So I went from there to a few years. I lived in Philadelphia for a little while after graduating, and then I moved to New York City a couple years after that. And during that time, I was making sound installations with many channels, and they were kind of oral history inspired. At least the first one was. That was called Sylvania. And I was living in South Philadelphia at that time in, I think, 2013, maybe 2012. And I went around. This is like a different young, like completely kind of uninhibited version of myself. I went around my neighborhood and just had a little portable recorder and interviewed people, strangers that I
Yeah,
met.
yeah,
And it was kind of a rough neighborhood. It was like a real melting pot with a lot of different people from different parts of the world. There were some refugees from Southeast Asia. There was like a heavy Italian population that went really many generations back. And it was also a very poor area, working class. And I went around and talked to people, got their permission to include those recordings in the final piece. and also got their contact information so I could invite them to the installation, which was going to happen in Center City, Philadelphia after that. So I patched together these stories. I broke things down based on common themes. I found that like work was a big topic. So a lot of people ended up talking about what they did for work, how many hours they worked every week. A lot of people were working like 60 or 80 hours a week. And so I kind of like, it ended up going in this working class direction, thinking about the division of our lives and how we parse out our time and survive.
Yeah.
And so I created like a sound forest using clips from all of those interviews and mixed them up with synthesized kind of like processed sine tones.
Mm.
And that became this installation with 18 channels. I've built a kind of very cheap 18 speaker setup using computer speakers and hanging them from the ceiling in this kind of sparse sound forest that you could walk through so that your proximity to the speakers would determine what mix you were hearing in the piece. So yeah, that was early days of before I was composing anything with notation. I was making these kinds of sound forest things. I did another piece after that that used 8 channels and a kind of similar setup, and that was called Incorporate. And I collaborated with a visual artist named Ann Yancha on that one. And we made this kind of magic school bus not inspired, but this idea of going inside the human body. We made this pod thing out of hanging silk paintings and speakers that one person could go inside and be kind of immersed in sound and colors from the silks. And I just took a bunch of little samples, again, of different people speaking and cut them up and put them together into rhythmic patterns that were randomized and also different filtered sine waves and lots of randomized parameters to create this kind of, it was supposed to be an installation that would go on forever, but it ended up dying after like 7.5 minutes. So I thought it was really great because the idea was that, the human body. So the piece itself, like the program that I created to generate the piece, it would just kind of bug out after 7.5 minutes and die. That was the early installation phase. Then I started writing a tiny bit for acoustic instruments. I wrote a solo viola piece called Olfactory Bulbs that was inspired by the connection between the sense of smell and memory and just how evocative smells are. So each movement was a different smell. And that was a piece I composed for my teacher, actually, my viola teacher for many years. And it used live electronics to kind of process the viola and evoke these different smells. There was sage, tar, and there was, snow. So I was kind of imagining the smells, but also the feelings that come with them. Yeah, and from there, I slowly kind of got into more and more different types of instruments. I went away from electronics for a few years just to dig into acoustic instruments because I needed to learn how to write for acoustic instruments. And I also started to get tired of the restrictions of electronic music and the lack of human connection there. I just wanted to be more in the world and among people, among musicians, making music. So that's how I started composing. That's how I started composing, really. It was just by working from, non-human musical material and slowly wanting to get closer and closer to people until eventually I made my way back to instruments.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist: creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.